global power shift. And much of this revolves around, the how the contending powers are able to dominate locations, resources, trade, technology, backed by military capabilities, because all this together cumulatively will alter the balance of power. And we, at this juncture, in the Indo-Pacific particularly, uh, in terms of BRI and other economic architecture that China is creating, it is increasing its influence significantly. On the other hand, United States of America, which was a preeminent power and it still remains in the Indo-Pacific, is into its own internal politics and may not have the capacity to challenge the Chinese hegemony. Nonetheless, there are initial indicators of some balancing groupings coming up. Example, we already know about Quad, and there are reports that President, say, Joe Biden, he may call for a summit of democracies in times to come. That is the new initiative, and probably with this, concepts like D10 or expanded G7 will probably gain more traction. From the Indian perspective, all these changes which are taking place, particularly these four corridors which are passing in the vicinity of India's neighborhood, China Pakistan Economic Corridor, China Nepal Economic Corridor, China Myanmar Economic Corridor, about 23 odd projects on which Chinese are working in the Indian Ocean region. And some kind of a competing initiatives taken by big powers and India's own ambitions and India's own policies. These are likely to crisscross and create frictions. While there's a possibility of competition, cooperation also, but at the present juncture, the geopolitical environment is not very conducive for some kind of a cooperation as we see the way the events have panned out. So, what implications will these corridors which are coming up in the Indo Pacific have? What are their geopolitical implications for the world, for the region, and particularly for India? We look forward to a very exciting discussion. And I'm sure that Admiral Soni, who has a practitioner's perspective on all these issues from the highest vantage point, will be able to steer this discussion and guide us through whatever issues we have. So, with these words, may I request Admiral Soni to give his opening remarks and then conduct the discussion. Over to you, sir.
Thank you so much, BK. So I have been interacting with Subhashish for the last year and a half too, and have guided him into making the kind of a structure that he has for his book and for his analysis of this very important region. And I am particularly quite happy and satisfied with what he has finally brought out. I have some comments, but which I will reserve after he has given his presentation. Now, this region has become extremely volatile and extremely important for us, and we need to realize that given our very peculiar geographical location, where we are a dominant country, but yet we are kind of still developing. We don't have very deep pockets. We are unable to really live up to the mantle that we have given ourselves of being the net security provider. Incidentally, no longer are we actually sticking to that term, and now we are saying that we would like to be the preferred security partner for all the countries. So it is indeed challenging for India in this new geopolitical conflicts as to where we stand, what we do. So any analysis that we do on this region must ultimately come out with some recommendations. It of course must educate everyone, but it also must come out finally with some recommendations as to what India ought to do. Now, also, secondly, I would say that these books and these analyses that get published, they are read by who all? They are read by young analysts. They are read by our young officers. They are read by scholars in countries where we are trying to influence what we do to them. So we must have a positive impact, while we must stick to the facts and we must project things as they are. But it should not escape us that while it might be an individual effort, but it is also some kind of publicity or PR in some ways. I will now hand over to Commander Sarangi to give his, to give a brief on what he has. I will warn Commander Sarangi that I will come out with, some recommendations. And, after you have given your presentation, and you are, of course, most welcome to, adopt these if you want, and if we can still make some changes and additions, basically some additions, then you can indulge me. Okay, thank you. Over to Commander Sarangi.
Thank you, sir. I will just share the presentation. I believe everybody can see it now. Good afternoon to all. So this is my third presentation. Already, I think overview of the project has been given, and today I will be covering the last two chapters. And like Admiral Soni said, he told me write it in simple language. So it is more of a general knowledge sort of book rather than a policy prescription sort of book. And I've generally avoided the military way of title, subtitle, and specific points. And I've tried to start from a very high level and move downwards. So next 45 minutes, I will speak about these two chapters. So chapter 8 is the implications, which I have called Attack Warning Red, and chapter 9 is What Can India Do, which I have called Maneuvering Through Restricted Waters. Coming to the implications, I start off with the background, and it is the general background that we have spoken of very often, so I will just skip it and come to the first point, that infrastructure development is actually pretty messy, and that is why countries avoid doing it directly. There are a lot of cost overruns, time overruns, and even the best of countries have a problem with it. There's a famous case of Berlin Airport, for example. So directly doing infrastructure development is something countries avoid, and we can see India's experience. We can take 3 examples, and there are certain things that happen that are beyond our control. Like in the case of Chabahar, for example, there was American sanctions, then we got exemption, then there were suppliers who didn't want to supply. Then when the port came, you had a Pakistan minister standing there, so it cast some doubt, and so on and so forth. Kaladan multimodal project, we made the port, we made the inland waterway structures, and then when we have to make the road, there are these insurgent groups which are creating a problem. Or in Seychelles, it started off as something which will help Seychelles in anti-piracy patrol at that point in time, and somewhere along the way it morphed into a political opposition. So since infrastructure development projects are messy, these pitfalls can hurt national reputation. What nations do to go ahead with this is they have transparent norms and procedures in place. Like you see in the case of Japan, which does through Zika, for example, there are very transparent norms in place as to which project will be taken up. Project is taken up only after viability is established. Loan is given only to people who can repay it back. If they cannot repay it back, there are procedures like Paris Club, which tells how it has to be done. So what China has done is that it has gone against this wisdom completely. It has gone ahead and given loans to people who, to nations who can't repay it. It has gone ahead with projects which may not be viable. And my thinking is that probably China has extrapolated its internal experiences to projects abroad. Internally, when in an authoritarian nation, you have opaque procedures, corruption, projects of questionable merit, it is not questioned. Outside, when you do it, it is open to question. Secondly, China has this strategy that you build and then there will be people who will use it. It is something that China can probably afford, but it's a very inefficient way. Like Kenya has this railway and it was supposed to bring in development, but it is struggling. So if we see the Belt and Road Initiative on the whole, those maps that come up, they give a very false sense of connectivity. But actually, when you see all the projects, it's more of a, like somebody from top has given a very loose policy directive, and people below, whether they're SOEs or provincial governments, they're all running to do some projects and then labeling it as BRI. So you don't have any reliable record of projects. You do not have any reliable record of finances. Then one more point that I would like to say is that the BRI and its dynamics vary from country to country. We should not be doing some broad brush labeling of BRI, like we say debt trap, for example. The dynamics of BRI vary from country to country. And even around in our neighborhood, we see the dynamics of China. It varies between a Pakistan and a Bangladesh. The last point that I would like to make here is that although the finances are not known, there are a lot of people who have created databases. And one thing is very clear, that there is a drop in financing. In fact, the financing reached the peak around 2015. And since 2017, financing has been dropping. One reason, of course, you could say is that the Chinese economy has certain headwinds. But more than that, it is that they have given loans to certain nations, and increasingly nations are asking for renegotiations. And it comes back to the same logic that if you are going to give loans to nations that cannot repay it, at some point they will ask for renegotiations because they cannot pay back. And somehow we have this impression that small nations do not have agency. I think small nations have a lot of agency of their own, and they do a lot of tactics to for their own interests. So if we take the three corridors that are there in the Indian Ocean region, right now, if you see the status, China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, the map will show you that there is a connectivity, but actually there is not much of connectivity. Phase 1 was more of a power project. Phase 2 was more of SEZs. The highway, that is Karakoram highway that is done, it's still closed for winter. The Gwadar port, there is no economic logic for it. The ML1 railway line that was supposed to happen is not happening because even Pakistan has realized it can't take any more loans and it wants concessions from China, which China is not willing to give. Similarly, if you see China-Myanmar Economic Corridor, again, the oil and gas pipeline, which are operating at, people are estimating it operating at 30% of its capacity. For 2 years, it had gone shut down. The railway will reach the borders of Myanmar next year. Within Myanmar, part of the route survey has been done. The other part, there's an agreement that survey will be done. Nepal, that railway line from Siatse to Kathmandu does not seem to be happening. So all three of these lines, they will take time. It is not as if BRI is a juggernaut which is going to come and wave us away. It is going to take time. However, three things of the BRI that I think are very clear now. Firstly, are that it is slowing down. The actual disbursals are much lower than what is estimated. People are talking of $1 trillion. But I have this report which says that between 2014 2019, it was probably around $337 billion, which is not a small amount, but much lesser than expectation. And now it has slowed down completely. So that's the first point. The second point is that since it is part of the party constitution, it cannot be done away with, and the timeline is till 2049. In fact, the planning stage is till 2021. So we are at early stages and it is going to continue. The third thing that has happened is from hard infrastructure, it is now shifted to digital. And now they're talking of green, they're talking of health. There is a latest white paper on Chinese aid, which tries to show that BRI will be for public goods. The digital part is the most substantial part because digital projects are easier to do. You just have to lay a cable, set up data centers, and it helps a lot in establishing Chinese standards and, of course, in harvesting data. Now, these three corridors that are coming, although they may take their time, but what they will finally do is what I say alteration of geography, and there are others who have said the same thing as well. With these three routes coming in, with Chinese enclaves being there, like your port city Colombo, in which you have a certain area which is a freehold to a Chinese company. We are talking of Hambon Tota having a certain Chinese population. I think these enclaves will be a bigger challenge than anything military when I think about all the possibilities that can be done with them. And then there is this exploration area which has been given by International Seabed Authority to China to explore. So all these together combine to give China the opportunity to claim resident status in the Indian Ocean region. This is a country which is nowhere near the Arctic Circle and says it is a near Arctic state. So I think it is very logical that it will claim resident status in the Indian Ocean region. It will be there in all regional initiatives, regional organizations. We have seen how it has been able to divide up ASEAN, it has been able to divide up EU. And at some point in time, much later, we might see this happening in the region, especially since the Indian Ocean region does not have a strong regional security architecture. And all these three routes, especially the one in the Mekong region and towards Myanmar border, we see Chinese migration coming in. And once you have Chinese populations, Chinese investment, it is logical that the PLA would also justify its presence. All the defense white papers that have been published till now, they also speak that the PLA will safeguard China's overseas interests. This build-up in the Indian Ocean region will, of course, take time. It is not something that is going to happen immediately. But what is already here is Chinese influence. And it's a very long list. We are aware of all these things which I have written in the book chapter. The first, of course, is economic. China is the largest trading nation for 130 nations around the world. Its outward investment is in 2018, it was $143 billion. It has invested even in India and startups. The political influence, we see that we saw it in Maldives, we saw it in Nepal, we're seeing some bit of it in Sri Lanka, and it is not zero-sum thinking to say that whenever Chinese political influence is up, India gets eased out, whether it was GMR airport, whether it was the map of Nepal, or now whether we see this Colombo East project, the kind of wrangling that is going on. And the biggest story right now is that of technological standards. Earlier, technical standards used to be between companies, private companies, and it was the Europeans who used to make the maximum money out of this. What China has done is to change it from being a commercial company-led thing to something which is led by states. Because the Chinese endeavor to have their national standards is very top-driven. And a lot of this fight will be over technological standards, which I'll come to later again. Like in the maritime domain, we can look at this Beidou satellite navigation system, or there is this port management system, wherein the system is for management of the port, but then you will be monitoring movement of all the ships, and the monitoring will be through the Beidou navigation system, and the information of all the ships will go through Chinese servers, so on and so forth. The other things, we are aware that it is primary global supplier for a lot of equipment, military equipment exports. Maximum of them is to Pakistan, Bangladesh, Myanmar, rare earths. Then there is soft power. Today we have children in Nepal learning Mandarin. We have students in Pakistan who are learning the language and going to China. And even the Indian demand for degrees, we have 20,000 odd doctors who have gone to Chinese universities. Of course, after coming back, a lot of them have failed in their exam and are not able to practice. That's a separate issue. And if we look at the maritime component of the BRI, it is similar to the BRI, that we had these maps which gave a sort of false sense that there is a connectivity project along. First it was 2 routes, then it became 4 routes. But although the Chinese keep using this term Maritime Silk Road, there actually is no coherent plan or master list of projects which you can say that, yes, this is what they are doing for this route. It is just a whole lot of port or port-related SEZ projects by SOEs or private companies, which the whole world has just collated together and is trying to analyze. So even after 7 years, the basic truths still remain, that maritime transport is the primary mode of transport, that inland port at Khargos that they have set up is, the throughput is nowhere compared to a port. And the main east-west route is the primary route, that is from Europe to Asia. This I have taken from the United Nations Commission of Transport and Development. And you can see the main east-west route continues to be the primary route. And in the integrated part, it is Asia which continues to dominate in maritime. So why do we need to study what China is doing in the maritime domain? This is a slide I had flashed last time also. Primarily because with China, the funding of the private and the public is a little blurred. The funding of the SOEs is done by the policy bank, so they're able to muscle their way through, which other private companies cannot do, and then China's assertive behavior and so on and so forth. But I think it makes sense to analyze China's investments separately between commercial and military. And if we see first the commercial part, post 2008, there was this thinking, there were a lot of publications which said that China has now become a leader in many of the fields of maritime industry, and it is reaching a point where it will dominate the maritime industry. Without getting into details, I will just say that the global maritime industry is just too complex for one player to dominate. Ownership is very diffused. I have given some examples in the book, some more I am putting up. And this whole thing that shipping companies of China have bought ports and they are redirecting traffic to that particular port. This was particularly Piraeus in Greece. This is an industry thing which has been happening for the last few years, that shipping companies, in order to escape the fluctuating tariff, they have actually bought ports. And once they bought a port and they also have the ships, they have obviously redirected traffic to those ports. So this is which has been happening all across. It is not just China. Or the thing that the domination of certain Chinese companies in container traffic. Again, it is because maximum of their traffic is from Chinese ports, which are the largest. If you see how much of it is overseas, around 30% of it is actually overseas. I'm talking about companies like COSCO and CP Ports. Just about 30% of it is overseas. Maximum is within China. And the geopolitical mapping does not match commercial ties. To give an example, I have just showing you this. Today, all container traffic in the world is covered by these three alliances: 2M Alliance, Ocean Alliance, and the Alliance. They are dominating the container traffic in the world. And you see the countries which make up this alliance: Denmark, Switzerland, China, France, Taiwan. It doesn't map onto our geopolitical realities. Coming to the ports, China's investment in ports, there are around 90 odd ports all over the world. This is one publication I've just picked up. There are more publications. Most of them are minority share. So if we have to analyze these, what we should be looking for are within these ports, which are majority owned, which are solely operated by Chinese companies. That is one. Secondly, the host nation matters. Some of these ports are in UAE, so I don't think anything military is going to happen in UAE. But then there are other nations, like, for example, Pakistan, where we know whether they are economically viable or not. And once we analyze that, there are some obvious things that pop up. And this I put in the chapter which is there in the Maritime Silk Road. We have this project in Cambodia, which is very mysterious. One private company has a so-called resort and airstrip, and now there's talk of the naval base also going to become a Chinese base. Hambantota, the question always is there as to why somebody would pay $1.2 billion for a port which is not commercially viable, although the Sri Lankan government has clarified issues. Gwadar, of course, is there. Djibouti is there. And this brings us to this whole question of places and bases. And I go by what Admiral Soni has told several times, that the Chinese are not going to do what the Americans have done, as to set up bases all around. They are doing a smarter thing, which is keep things below the threshold. Do as you do in peacetime. Go to a port for a port visit where a Chinese logistics company will supply you. And you just continue to stay there. You can stay there for 3 months. This, of course, will not be valid in case of hostilities. And the exception to all this is, of course, we know Pakistan. Even CNS last year, he said that it's a matter of time before the base comes up in Pakistan. So we know at some point there will be a Chinese base in Pakistan. And then there's Chinese literature on what they call strategic strong points or maritime hubs. The Science of Military Strategy 2015 and there onwards. But it has not happened yet. At some point, whether it will happen or not, we'll have to see. Now, what are the implications of the Chinese presence? We have these details are all known, that there's an anti-piracy escort force, that we had submarines coming between 2013 to 2018. We also know that at any time there are 3 to 4 survey vessels or satellite tracking ships, and the data that they collect has dual use. What you use for satellite tracking can be used for missile tracking, collection of underwater data for which can be used for submarine operations. We know this, so I will just skip this. There have been multiple reports of ships operating with AIS switched off. This is one such report, and you just see these 4 ships have been operating for 3 years, and you see the areas that they have been surveying. Similarly, this is another report which I picked up from an academic paper, and this Xi'an-1 ship, which in 2019 was found in our EEZ and was told to move out. This academic paper says that since 2010, in collaboration with Sri Lanka institution, it has been mapping the ocean floor, and you see the area that it is mapping. Similarly, now we have the use of underwater gliders which are being deployed. Gliders are basically, they don't have power, but they can tilt either way, and then they have large wings. So when they move down, there's a trailing antenna which gives out the data. When they go down, they collect the data and they move out. So underwater gliders have been deployed in the Indian Ocean. There have been instances of 4 gliders which have been picked up by Indonesian fishermen. And it's quite clear that the Chinese are preparing for submarine operations through the archipelago straits and maybe later in the Indian Ocean. And if we see what is the possibility, what are the future roles for the PLA Navy, we know largest Navy, largest Coast Guard, largest fishing militia and all that. But the priority right now is around the peripheral waters. And before they move to the Indian Ocean, they will have to do certain things like set up surveillance capabilities. It might be space-based, it might be maritime patrol aircraft, but they will have to set up all those things before they move into the Indian Ocean. Once they move into the Indian Ocean, there are a number of things we will face. One of them is we love to say that we are the first responders to any HADR or any such thing. Once the Chinese Navy is here with its LPDs and all, we will not be the only ones. And going even further, whatever we have seen in East China Sea, South China Sea, will it happen in the Indian Ocean? I would say yes, it can happen. Not now, maybe 2 decades from now. So we will obviously have a punitive capability to provide deterrence, BrahMos and all those things. And I have written a little about this myth of the Malacca dilemma, which everybody attributes it to President Hu Jintao's speech, and actually provides a cover for Chinese actions. If they have a Malacca dilemma, we also have a reverse Malacca dilemma. 55% of our trade passes through that. An entire maritime security is about everybody, is an insurance against each other. If the Royal Navy caught an Iranian ship of Gibraltar, Iran caught a British ship in the Gulf. And then this whole thing about choking the Malacca, which is not feasible. And we know that it's you can't just choke an international waterway, and there are so many problems in doing that, but we tend to be very simplistic in saying we'll choke the Malacca and so on and so forth. So I've written one paragraph on that, and then the scenarios which have already been discussed. Coming to the next chapter, which talks about what can India do, and I start off again at a very high level, and the first 3 basic points I make at a very high level. The first is that our economy growth has to be a priority, and also the fact that our young age population, that's not going to last forever. So we have this one window where either we move up or then we can forget everything else. The second point that I want to make is that when you are facing asymmetrical disadvantages, the only way to face up to it is to forge partnerships, and that's what we are doing. And it is not an age of formal alliances, it will be informal alliances. And we also have to forge partnerships so that we can provide alternatives in infrastructure building to third nations. And the second point, or rather the third big point that I want to make, is that we will have to make a lot of choices sooner rather than later. We love to tread the middle path, but I think that middle path is getting eroded. We had this event where Prime Minister went to one side, one trilateral, and said Jai, and then he went to another trilateral and RIC. I think that will be difficult to do in the years ahead. And these choices we will have to make, not just political. The choices will have to be in terms of technology and in terms of standards. And to my mind, this fight over technology and standards is the biggest fight going on right now in the world, and we see it right now for, let's say, internet, wherein USA was actually dominating the internet, and now other nations are trying to get their sovereignty. China, or rather Huawei, has presented an alternate standards. Same fight is over data, same fight is over payment gateways, currency, although the dollar is still predominant. And the most visible, of course, is this fight over 5G. And the third choice that we'll have to make is in terms of economic opening up. There is this whole debate over whether free trade agreements are of any use to India or not, which I have made one paragraph. But the point is that at some point, we will have to open up to the world if we want the global value chain to be in India. So these are the three big points that I make. And then I come down to the lower level when I start talking about infrastructure. And then I start from India itself to say that the first step that India has to take is to build infrastructure within India. This is, of course, something Government of India knows very well. Our expenditure on infrastructure has been increasing over the years. There is case studies and reports in the economic report of the Government of India, like the one which came up the day before yesterday, and they gave case studies as to how we need to improve our logistics. But 2 points I want to make. Firstly, we have adequate avenues of finance. Unlike other countries, we have adequate avenues of finance. The problem is how much of it we can absorb ourselves. Next point is that does India need the BRI? And of course, as events have shown, we do not require the BRI. Signing the MOU of the BRI, it's quite, the usefulness of it is quite debatable. There are countries like Philippines which signed on to it with great hopes but got nothing. There is famous case of President Xi Jinping going to Italy and France, and Italy signing on BRI but getting much lesser than what France got without signing the BRI. And further, I think those three north to south routes which come to the Indian Ocean are economically not viable unless India joins it. Development of island territories, a lot of things happening, but then again, execution is the issue. We heard of smart islands in one joint statement between India and Japan, and then it all went away. The Niti Aayog presented ready to launch projects, means projects for which environmental clearances has been done, everything has been done, and still there are no takers. We are supposed to make a transshipment port in Great Nicobar. Prime Minister has also announced it recently, but we have been hearing, hopefully some work is going on there. India's neighborhood has to be its priority. South Asia is poorly connected. It has very low intra-regional trade. There is one Western nation which we can't do anything about, but the rest of the region, we need to connect up. And since the announcement of our Neighborhood First Policy 2014, massive increase in connectivity projects have taken place of all types. I mean, we are talking about direct shipping lines, we are talking about multimodal transport from Bhutan to Bangladesh, through Brahmaputra, from Nepal to Kolkata, through the Ganges, common electricity grid, improvement in road connectivity, bringing back old rail lines. A lot of work is going on, but once the workload increases, it I think brings up all your capacity issues and coordination issues. So some of it I have highlighted, and state governments are vital for the implementation. In 2017, Government of Assam set up a Department of Act East Policy Affairs. Other state governments are also crucial for implementation of these policies. Now, how to go ahead with these development partnerships? I have labeled it the India Way. This is the name of the book of the External Affairs Minister. And the India Way is to cater for genuine requirements of the smaller nations in consultation and participation of the local population. So we are talking of economic prosperity, sustainable development, protection from national calamities, halting rising sea levels, protection of resources in exclusive economic zone, and so on and so forth. All these words that I've given here, they are part of various pronouncements that have been made by the Prime Minister. And this list that you see now is actually the note that India gave as to why it is not joining the BRI. And if you take the entire list, this is what is the India Way. And we have signaled responsibility by having International Solar Alliance, the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure. We are complying with the Paris Agreement more than what we should be doing. We have set up a tsunami warning system. Both are SAGAR and IPOI, both of them are very open, free, inclusive proposals. One major recommendation, rather thought that I want to make is that India has a lot of advantages, lot of capability in provision of public goods. We have a very safe payment gateway. We have a provision of giving direct cash benefits. We have a space mission, which is very frugal, pharmaceutical industry, advanced financial markets. We can offer this to the world. And one example is that Span Africa e-network, which we have done for the last 11 years now. And on that backbone, we are giving e-education, telemedicine. We need to work on this. And recent events have shown that it is possible to do that the way we have done for COVID. By May 2020, we had spent some 16 million on sending essential medicines and kits to 90 nations. Overall, we have sent these to 150 countries, and out of that, 80 countries has been grant. And whether it is PPE, N95 masks, ventilators, our exports have gone up substantially. And now, of course, it is vaccine. So I think this provision of public goods is a major thing that we can do. Another thing that we need to do is the development of homegrown standards. We have our own satellite navigation system. In 5G, IIT Madras has filed what is known as a standard essential patent. So this is one patent which is going to get cleared. We have only one. Huawei has 15% of these, but it's still a beginning. RuPay payment, whether it is from Bangladesh to UAE, we have been trying to do. So we need to get more and more homegrown standards popularized. Another important point is this about legal capability, having rule setting, rule making capability. For far too long, we have been listening to others who make rules for common areas like for the internet governance, for example. Why can't we have our legal minds and our domain experts together and make rules which the world can then discuss. I mean, we say freedom of navigation. Ironically, India and China are on the same side on this. Why can't we come up with a document and say this is what is our definition or more advanced definition of freedom of navigation? Similarly, consultancy services, which is similar to this Blue Dot network. Like, for example, now Myanmar is using services of a Swiss consultancy firm to scrutinize this Muse Mandalay railway line that Chinese have given. They used consultancy for Kochu, similarly to bring down the cost to the stage 1. They're using a German consultancy firm to scrutinize this Yangon City project that the Chinese have given. So we have the capability to do these sort of consultancy, and I think we should be looking at doing it. One word about the execution capability. I feel, although it's a contrary opinion, that it is not desirable for government to be directly involved in infrastructure projects. Like I said, it tends to be messy. It's one thing for railways or Indian Oil to do a project. It's another thing for 2 joint secretaries to sit down and work out some Chabahar or some other project. And on top of that, India has a serious shortage of diplomatic staff. I think we need to set up a separate agency for development partnership, maybe hive it off from MEA. Better. And one word about the softness of soft power or culture. We tend to showcase a lot of this cultural links, but I think they have serious limitations, especially because every nation has a distinct identity and it doesn't like to be told that its identity is common to A, B, C, X, Y, Z. And this is particularly relevant for nations around India. Coming to maritime issues, and I have already written on these maritime issues, but I want to make this probably the most dominant thing in this chapter. I will add more maritime issues of India, which are like out of sight, out of mind. So if you see all the sectors, India is lagging in almost all the sectors, except for shipbreaking and seafarers. We are lagging, and there are so many sectors we can see are in the maritime domain. And so if we see ports, throughputs of Indian ports are much lower than the biggest in the world. Only 2 container ports in top 50. Turnaround time is still twice that of the best ports. We have, anytime we have greenfield project, we have environmental issues. This I had taken from the economic survey. You can see, although the capacity of our ports is going up and the orange line is the turnover time, that is coming down, but still not up to international standards. And then there is the whole issue that India does not have a transshipment port. We still rely on Salalah, Dubai, Colombo handling 60%. We set up one in 2011, that is struggling. Yeah, other options, Inam, Tamil Nadu cancelled, Vizhinjam, Kerala still in progress, Great Nicobar we just announced. Similarly, shipbuilding. We just have 1% share of the entire world. It is dominated by China, South Korea, Japan. They take 80 to 90%. In early 2000s, we had private shipyards coming up, but except for L&T, they all collapsed. Shipping, in terms of tonnage, ownership 18th, but if you take value, we are not even in top 25, which means our ships are, merchant ships I'm talking, are old. And only 7.9% of India's overseas trade is carried by its own flag vessels. Largest shipping companies, Shipping Corporation of India, Great Eastern Shipping, nowhere near to the world's biggest. Coming, so this maritime part, I will add more. I think I should add more because it's not spoken about much. Finally, I come to a few issues of security. One is supply chain reliability. We have understood the dangers of dependency on a single nation. So now Foreign Secretary has started talking about Sagar also having supply chain resilience. We have Australia, India, Japan, supply chain resilience. But this decoupling can only be gradual and it can be selective. I don't think, I would say it is impossible that you can decouple from the second largest economy in the world. There are a whole lot of MSMEs in India whose entire business model is on cheap imports from China. You can do it only for certain sectors. And that is what the PLI scheme of Government of India is. This is the scheme. These are the sectors on which we want to be Atmanirbhar. In going further in terms of security, I had thought of this. It didn't quite work out, but basically I wanted to say that we have a East versus West conundrum, because the Americans always tell us to look Pacific and look East because their interests match, and westwards our interests don't match and they don't talk about it. But if we take these four things into account: trade, energy, sources of natural resources, sources of threat, it is both sides. Like trade is probably more towards the east and energy is more towards the west. I need to sharpen this part to bring this out. Finally, military issues, I don't want to talk much, so I'll keep it very less. I have flashed some points and I will keep it to the minimal. And the absolutely final point is what I said: do as you say and say as you do. This has been a pet peeve of mine. I want to put it somewhere in my chapter that we need to publish policy documents. And recently, one draft document of India's Arctic policy has come out, and I was very happy to see that somebody has thought of that. We need to publish policy documents. I am overshooting my time, so I think I will stop here. The conclusion basically sums up the whole thing, and I basically say that infrastructure is not just China. There are others who have also done things. So that's my presentation. I